At just after dawn on December 25, 2016, in a quiet village called Goring-on-Thames, inside a softly lit bedroom where Christmas morning should have meant warmth, voices, and the sound of wrapping paper being torn open, George Michael, 53 years old, a global pop icon who had sold over 100 million records, filled stadiums on multiple continents, written songs that became the soundtrack of entire generations, and spent more than 3 decades living under relentless public attention, was found lying still in bed, alone, as church bells rang somewhere outside and the rest of the world prepared to celebrate. There were no flashing cameras, no screaming fans, no final performance, just silence, holiday lights glowing faintly through a window, and a man who had once seemed untouchable slipping away while families everywhere else were gathering closer. How did a singer whose voice defined joy, love, and desire for millions end up dying quietly on the loneliest morning of the year? What really happened behind the fame, behind the carefully controlled smile, behind the long years when George Michael slowly stepped out of the spotlight and into something far darker? And why did Christmas, the day of togetherness, become the moment his life finally ended in isolation? This is not the story of a hitmaker or a pop legend as the world remembers him. This is the untold story of the last Christmas, the years that led to it, and the silence that fame could not protect him from. Long before the silence of that Christmas morning, George Michael had lived a life that felt impossibly loud. Born Georgios Kyriakos Panayiotou, the son of a Greek Cypriot restaurateur, he grew up in North London with a hunger that was equal parts ambition and escape, a quiet determination to become something larger than the narrow streets and expectations around him. By his early 20s, that determination had exploded into global fame almost overnight. As part of Wham, he didn't just make pop music. He embodied youth, freedom, and optimism, filling radios and television screens with infectious hooks, bright smiles, and a sense that life itself could be light and effortless. Stadiums sold out, singles climbed charts across continents, and millions of young listeners saw him not just as a singer, but as a symbol of joy. When he stepped away from Wham to pursue a solo career, the transformation was immediate and staggering. Albums sold in numbers that defied logic, awards piled up, and his voice, smooth, aching, intimate, proved capable of carrying not just dance anthems, but vulnerability, longing, and heartbreak. He became one of the most successful songwriters of his era, a man whose melodies and lyrics seemed to understand emotions listeners struggled to name themselves. On stage, under blinding lights, he appeared confident, generous, almost playful, someone who belonged effortlessly in the spotlight. Interviews reinforced the image. Witty, charming, reflective, a star who seemed in control of both his talent and his destiny. To the public, George Michael was everywhere. His songs played at weddings, parties, and holidays. His face appeared on magazine covers. His tours drew tens of thousands night after night. Fame did not seem to weigh him down. It looked like it lifted him, as if he were one of the rare few who could carry success without being crushed by it. Yet even during those years of triumph, there were hints of a deeper struggle, moments when the brightness dimmed just enough to suggest something unresolved beneath the surface. The pressure to remain perfect, desirable, and endlessly productive came with a cost that could not be measured in record sales. As the industry demanded more access and the public demanded more intimacy, the line between the performer and the person began to blur. Behind the applause, George Michael learned early that love from millions did not necessarily translate into safety, and that admiration could feel hollow when it came at the expense of privacy and truth. While the world celebrated his success, a quieter tension was forming between who he was expected to be and who he actually was when the lights went out and the noise faded. And as the years passed, that tension would begin to carve small, almost invisible cracks into a life that looked, from the outside, perfectly blessed. The rise had been so fast, so intoxicating, that it left George Michael little time to understand what it was taking from him. Fame arrived before adulthood had fully settled, before identity had hardened into something stable, and from the beginning it demanded performance not just on stage, but in life itself. Every appearance, every interview, every lyric was scrutinized, decoded, consumed, and repurposed by an audience that felt entitled to know him, even as it only ever touched the surface. To survive that pressure, George learned to control the narrative with precision. What he revealed, what he denied, what he turned into song rather than conversation. The mask he built was elegant and convincing. The confident pop star, the romantic voice of desire, the man who seemed comfortable in his own skin. Underneath it, however, lay a constant tension between truth and expectation. A private self that felt increasingly incompatible with the role he was expected to play. As the years passed, that tension grew heavier, especially as questions about his sexuality, his relationships, and his need for privacy collided with a media culture hungry for exposure. Each confrontation pushed him further inward, teaching him that silence could feel safer than honesty, and distance more manageable than vulnerability. Success did not slow the pace. It accelerated it. Tours stretched across continents, studios replaced bedrooms, and nights blurred into mornings as deadlines and obligations stacked up relentlessly. George Michael became a master of delivering exactly what was required of him. Emotion on cue, charm on demand, while postponing the work of caring for himself. Alcohol and substances slipped into his life not as rebellion, but as relief, a way to quiet the constant hum of expectation and to reclaim some sense of control over his own mind. At first, they seemed functional, even invisible, folded neatly into a lifestyle that outsiders assumed was glamorous. Over time, they became habits, then dependencies, then warning signs that those closest to him noticed long before the public did. He began withdrawing between projects, canceling appearances, retreating into long periods of isolation where the world could not reach him and he did not have to perform. When he returned, he did so polished and professional, reinforcing the illusion that everything was fine, that nothing fundamental had shifted. But the cracks were spreading quietly, widening with each year he spent balancing the persona against the person. There were moments when the strain became impossible to ignore. Public controversies, legal troubles, health scares that hinted at a body under stress, a mind worn thin by years of internal conflict. Each incident drew headlines and commentary, yet rarely addressed the deeper pattern forming beneath them. George Michael was not self-destructing in dramatic fashion. He was eroding, piece by piece, retreating into a smaller and smaller world where he could exist without constant surveillance. Relationships suffered under that retreat. Friends described long stretches of silence, missed calls, plans postponed indefinitely. Love, when it appeared, carried the weight of secrecy and fear, shaped by the lessons fame had taught him about exposure and loss. Even as he continued to write and record, the joy that once animated his work grew harder to access, replaced by introspection, melancholy, and a sense that the cost of being seen had grown too high. As he moved into his 40s and then his early 50s, George Michael's life took on a quieter rhythm. The massive tours and relentless schedules gave way to long periods at home, nights spent alone, routines that provided structure but little connection. He chose privacy deliberately, purchasing homes in places where he could disappear into ordinary life, yet the isolation that came with that choice slowly deepened. Health issues compounded the problem, his body bearing the marks of years lived at full volume. Doctors issued warnings, friends expressed concern, but change came slowly, constrained by habits formed over decades, and by a lingering belief that endurance was proof of strength. He had spent so long being resilient for everyone else that admitting fragility felt like surrender. By December 2016, that pattern had become the backdrop of his existence. Christmas approached quietly, without the public appearances or festive performances that had once defined the season for him. In Goring-on-Thames, the village was calm, wrapped in winter stillness, its streets lined with lights and decorations that spoke of togetherness. Inside his home, George Michael lived a far more muted version of the holiday, one shaped by solitude rather than celebration. The early hours of Christmas Day arrived without ceremony. There was no dramatic crisis, no final message to the world, only a body already under strain reaching its limit in silence. When he was found later that morning, the contrast was unbearable. Outside, a world celebrating life and family. Inside, a man who had spent years withdrawing from both, gone quietly in his own bed. The shock that followed was immediate and global, yet deeply impersonal, unfolding through headlines, tributes, and playlists rather than touch or presence. Fans mourned collectively, replaying songs that once felt joyous now reframed by loss. Friends and collaborators spoke of kindness, generosity, and a sensitivity that the public had only partially glimpsed. Investigations concluded with clinical language, natural causes, underlying conditions, but those explanations could never fully account for the emotional truth of what had happened. George Michael did not die simply because his body failed. He died at the end of a long process of retreat, a life gradually narrowed by fame, fear, and the belief that isolation was safer than connection. The tragedy of that Christmas morning was not just the timing, but the realization that for years before it happened, he had been learning how to disappear. The aftermath of George Michael's death unfolded with a strange combination of noise and distance, as if the world mourned loudly while remaining impossibly far away. Within hours, news alerts flashed across phones, television anchors struggled to maintain composure, and social media filled with disbelief that a voice so woven into the soundtrack of people's lives had fallen silent on Christmas Day. Tributes poured in from fellow artists, actors, and public figures, each recalling a different version of George Michael. The songwriter who understood pain, the performer who gave everything on stage, the private man whose generosity rarely made headlines. Yet beneath the global outpouring lay an unsettling truth. Most of this grief was retrospective, assembled after the fact, shaped by memory rather than presence. In the days that followed, the details of his passing were discussed with clinical restraint. Investigators confirmed natural causes, citing heart-related conditions, language that reduced a complex life to a brief medical conclusion. For fans, the explanation provided closure. For those who knew him personally, it offered little comfort. What lingered instead was the sense of inevitability, the recognition that George Michael had been living at a distance from the world long before his body finally gave out. Christmas, once a season of brightness associated with some of his most enduring songs, became inseparable from loss, replayed each year with an undertone of sadness that no remix or radio tribute could erase. The industry responded the only way it knew how, by celebrating the catalog. Albums returned to the charts, documentaries were commissioned, playlists were curated, and his image reappeared everywhere, polished and eternal. In death, George Michael was suddenly visible again, his absence transforming him back into a presence. But the revival carried an irony that was difficult to ignore. The man who had withdrawn from the spotlight to protect himself was now more exposed than ever, his private struggles flattened into symbols of genius and tragedy for public consumption. The quiet routines of his final years, the long nights, the closed doors, the deliberate distance, were overshadowed by montages of stadium lights and archival interviews, as if the world preferred the comfort of the familiar myth to the discomfort of the human reality. For those left behind, the grief was more complicated. Friends spoke of regret for conversations postponed, calls unanswered, assumptions made about his resilience. The realization came too late that strength had been mistaken for stability and privacy for peace. George Michael had been generous to a fault, supporting causes and individuals far from the cameras, yet had struggled to accept help himself, trapped by a lifetime of self-reliance and the fear of becoming a burden. In reflecting on his final years, a pattern emerged. A man who gave the world everything it asked for, then slowly stepped away, hoping that distance would offer relief, only to find that isolation magnified the very pain he was trying to escape. The tragedy of his decline lies not in scandal or spectacle, but in its quietness. There was no single moment when everything collapsed, no clear warning sign that forced intervention. Instead, there was a gradual narrowing of life, a shrinking of connection, until the extraordinary became ordinary and the lonely became routine. By the time the world realized how alone George Michael had become, it was already too late to change the ending. George Michael's life forces an uncomfortable reckoning with the stories we tell ourselves about success. From the outside, he appeared protected by fame, wealth, and universal admiration. Yet those same forces quietly narrowed the space where he could exist honestly. The applause that once felt like validation slowly replaced intimacy, and the discipline required to survive constant scrutiny became a habit of self-containment that left little room for vulnerability. Over time, the mask did not simply hide pain. It taught him to treat pain as something to manage alone, something that should never interrupt the performance. There is a particular cruelty in the way society rewards those who appear strongest. We praise composure, celebrate resilience, and mistake privacy for peace, often assuming that people who have everything do not need anything from us. George Michael's story challenges that assumption. It shows how easily admiration can become distance, how quickly independence can harden into isolation, and how dangerous it is to confuse endurance with healing. His withdrawal was not a rejection of the world, but an attempt to survive it on terms that felt safer, even as those terms slowly cut him off from the very connections that might have sustained him. The lesson is not that fame inevitably destroys, but that it magnifies whatever is left unresolved. When fear, shame, or exhaustion are hidden behind success, they do not disappear. They wait. And when asking for help feels like failure, silence becomes a default language. George Michael taught the world how to turn longing into melody, yet struggled to grant himself the same compassion he offered through his songs. His final years remind us that no amount of recognition can replace being truly known, and that strength, when performed too long, can become another form of loneliness. The story closes where it began, on a Christmas morning that should have been filled with voices and movement, but instead unfolded in stillness. In that quiet house in Goring-on-Thames, the lights outside continued to glow, the world continued to celebrate, and George Michael's life came to an end without ceremony, without witnesses, without the kind of farewell reserved for legends. What remains now are echoes. A voice drifting from radios each December, melodies that once promised joy now carrying an undertone of loss, and a career frozen forever at its most radiant moments. George Michael will always be remembered for the songs, the records, the nights when arenas moved as one to the sound of his voice. But behind those images stands another truth, softer and harder to face. The truth of a man who spent years learning how to disappear because disappearing felt safer than being exposed. His final silence was not a contradiction of his life's work, but its quiet warning that even the brightest fame cannot replace connection, and that even those who seem most adored may be the ones most in need of reaching out. In the end, the legend the world celebrates and the man who died alone on Christmas morning were the same person, divided only by expectation and fear. His story asks something simple and urgent of those who hear it now: to look past the masks people wear, to check on those who seem strongest, and to remember that love, once withheld or postponed, cannot be replayed like a song. Because when the music stops and the lights go out, what matters is not how loudly the world applauded, but whether someone was close enough to hear the silence.